My name is Morgan Shaw. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've occupied roles that look small from the outside. Supportive daughter, dependable sibling, quiet professional who never needed to raise her voice to be heard. Or at least, that's how I thought it worked. People tend to describe me with words like steady, low maintenance, and easygoing. I've learned those words often mean something else, unlikely to push back. I don't command a room when I enter it. I don't interrupt. I don't dramatize my emotions. And because of that, I'm often underestimated, not out of malice, but out of habit. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about exposing anyone for entertainment. It's about how power can move quietly through a family system, how truth can be handled with care or turned into a tool. It's about what happens when someone decides that your story belongs to them more than it belongs to you. Over the next hour, I'm going to walk you through a period of my life when I learned, slowly and without spectacle, what it means to reclaim authorship over your own narrative. There are no heroes or villains here, just people making choices and living with the consequences of those choices. What you'll hear is not a dramatic retelling meant to shock you. It's a chronological, honest account of how a relationship with my brother shifted in ways I didn't fully understand at first, and how a single act, framed as concern, loyalty, even righteousness, changed the way my family saw me overnight. My brother outed me to the family to win their support. Not with cruelty in his voice, not with anger, but with timing. At first, I believed silence was the mature response. I believed that staying calm meant staying in control. I believed that if I just kept living the way I always had, things would rebalance on their own. What I didn't realize then was that truth became a weapon the moment it served him. And once that happens, pretending otherwise only deepens the wound. This story will move through long stretches of quiet, missed comments, small dismissals, subtle shifts in tone, because that's how real power dynamics change. Rarely with explosions. More often, with assumptions left unchallenged. I won't embellish conversations or assign motives I can't prove. I'll tell you what was said, what was done, and how it landed inside me. I'll also tell you how I responded, not impulsively, not perfectly, but deliberately. If you've ever felt invisible inside a system that benefits from your compliance, if you've ever watched someone else control the narrative of your life while insisting they were just being honest, then this story may feel uncomfortably familiar. I'm sharing it not to ask for sympathy, but to offer clarity and maybe permission. Before we begin, I want to ask you something gently. Have you ever stayed quiet because you thought it was safer, only to realize later that silence had already chosen a side? To my family, I was easy to place. I was the one who didn't cause worry, the one who adapted, the one who could be trusted to handle it without needing reassurance or applause. If there was tension in a room, I softened it. If there was a gap, I filled it. If someone needed support, I showed up. Quietly, reliably, without keeping score. That became my shape. My parents would describe me as independent. My relatives used to be mature. My brother, older by 2 years, louder by nature, liked to say I was low drama, usually with a smile that implied this was a compliment. And maybe it was. But it also meant no one checked in too closely. No one asked what things cost me. At family gatherings, I was the one clearing plates while conversations continued without me. Not because I was told to, because it felt natural. I was good at reading rooms, at noticing when something needed doing before it was requested. Over time, that instinct turned into expectation. I didn't resent it, not at first. There's a strange comfort in being useful, in being seen as dependable. When people expect little conflict from you, they also expect little resistance. And if you don't resist, the system stays smooth, predictable, calm. That calm became part of my identity. My brother, on the other hand, was perceived as the force in the family, opinionated, decisive, someone whose reactions needed managing. He took up space effortlessly, and people adjusted around him without naming it. His emotions were treated as signals. Mine were treated as background noise. Again, this wasn't cruelty. It was a pattern. If he raised a concern, it was discussed. If I mentioned discomfort, it was reframed. You're strong, they'd say. You'll be fine. And I believed them. Strength to me meant not needing to insist. Inside the family story, I played the role of balance. The one who didn't escalate. The one who kept things together by not pulling too hard in any direction. I didn't interrupt narratives. I absorbed them, even when it came to my own life. When I made choices that didn't align perfectly with expectations, career shifts, relationships, personal boundaries, I explained them gently, carefully, as if asking permission. I learned how to pre-soften truths so they'd land without disruption. I learned how to reassure others before checking in with myself. This wasn't self-sacrifice in a dramatic sense. It was a gradual erosion. What's important to understand is that no one ever said, "You matter less," but everything in the structure implied it. Attention followed intensity. Authority followed volume. And I had neither. I became fluent in being overlooked. When family decisions were made, I was consulted late, after opinions had formed. When disagreements arose, I was positioned as the mediator, never the stakeholder. My perspective was valued only insofar as it kept the peace, and I accepted that, because peace felt like responsibility. Looking back, I can see how clearly defined my role was. I was reliable, useful, and emotionally self-contained. I didn't need protecting. I didn't need advocacy. And so when something about me became useful to someone else's agenda, there was no internal alarm in the system to stop it, because no one was used to asking what it would cost me. I didn't know then that invisibility isn't neutral. It's a position, and positions can be exploited. At the time, I still believed that being steady would protect me, that restraint equaled safety, that if I lived honestly and harmed no one, honesty would be returned in kind. I hadn't yet learned that honesty can be reshaped once it leaves your mouth, or your control. And I definitely hadn't learned that the role people assign you becomes the lens through which they interpret everything you do afterward. To them, I was the calm one, the strong one, the one who would understand. They never considered that understanding doesn't mean consent. And I didn't yet know how dangerous that misunderstanding could be. The first time it happened, I almost missed it. That's the part that still unsettles me, the subtlety. There was no confrontation, no raised voice, no dramatic moment that would later replay in my mind with clarity. Just a comment, made casually, in a room full of people who didn't register it as anything more than conversation. It was during a family dinner. One of those ordinary evenings where nothing significant is supposed to occur. Plates were being passed, someone was telling a story that had already been told before, and I was half listening while pouring water into glasses. My brother mentioned something about me, not directly, not to me. He was responding to a question from one of our relatives, something vague about my life, my situation, said with curiosity but no urgency. Before I could answer, he did. He laughed lightly and said, "Oh, she doesn't really talk about it. You know how she is." It was said fondly. That's what made it hard to object to. The tone suggested familiarity and closeness, like he was protecting my privacy, translating me for the room, except I hadn't asked him to. The conversation moved on. No one noticed. No one paused to check if that was accurate or fair. I smiled reflexively and kept doing what I was doing. The moment passed, but something stayed behind. It wasn't what he said. It was what it implied, that my silence was a trait, not a choice. That my story was something he could summarize. That my presence didn't require direct engagement. Later that night, I told myself I was being sensitive, that it didn't matter, that he was just filling space, as he often did. I rationalized it the way I always had. It's not worth making things awkward. That was my reflex, to minimize the impact before anyone else could. But over the next few weeks, similar moments appeared. Small, almost invisible, comments made on my behalf. Clarifications were offered before I spoke. Context added where none was needed. Each one was minor enough to dismiss. Together, they formed a pattern. The family seemed to accept his framing without question, not because they distrusted me, but because it was easier. He spoke with confidence. I did not interrupt. The path of least resistance became the official version. What struck me most was how unintentional it all seemed. He wasn't malicious. He didn't smirk or lower his voice. He acted like he was helping, like he was smoothing edges before they caused discomfort. And maybe he believed that. but I began to feel edited, not erased, adjusted. It's difficult to articulate the feeling of being slowly rewritten in real time, especially when the edits are subtle and the editor insists they're on your side. There's no clear line to defend, no accusation to make, just a growing sense that something intimate is being handled without your consent. I remember sitting in my car after one visit, hands still on the steering wheel, replaying a comment he'd made earlier. Not because it was offensive, but because it had replaced something I would have said myself. That was the cut. Small, clean, easy to ignore. Everyone else did. To them, nothing had happened. To me, something had shifted. I began to notice how quickly my silence was filled, how my calm was interpreted as acquiescence, how my brother's version of me traveled faster than my own voice. Still, I didn't speak up. Part of me feared that if I objected, I'd look defensive, or ungrateful, or dramatic, breaking the very role that had kept things smooth for so long. I told myself it wasn't the hill to die on, but it wasn't about dying on a hill. It was about noticing where the ground was being taken. That first small cut didn't hurt because of its depth. It hurt because of its precision. It revealed how easily my narrative could be handled by someone who knew exactly when to speak and when I wouldn't. And in that moment, without knowing it yet, I learned something important. You don't lose power all at once. You lose it in pieces small enough to justify. Once I noticed it, I couldn't unsee it. What had started as isolated moments began to feel routine. Not because they grew more aggressive, but because they grew more accepted. The pattern didn't escalate. It settled in, and that made it harder to challenge. My brother began speaking around me more often than to me. If someone asked how I was doing, he'd jump in with a summary before I could answer. If a topic drifted towards something personal, he'd preface it with, "She doesn't mind me saying this," even when we had never discussed it. No one questioned him. Why would they? He sounded confident, familiar, reasonable, and I stayed quiet. At first, I told myself I was choosing maturity, that correcting him would seem petty, that I didn't want to turn normal conversation into a referendum on boundaries. I convinced myself that silence was generosity. But generosity, I learned, becomes expectation very quickly. The more I allowed these moments to pass, the more comfortable everyone became with the arrangement. My brother is the interpreter. I was the subject. I was still present, still physically in the room, but narratively, I was being handled. It wasn't overt disrespect. That's what made it so insidious. There were no insults, no dismissive gestures, just assumptions layered on top of one another until they felt like truth. I'd hear phrases like, "Well, you know how Morgan is," followed by conclusions I hadn't agreed to, or decisions made with me in mind that I had never been consulted about. My name was being used as justification, and every time I considered pushing back, I hesitated, because pushing back would require disrupting the image everyone had of me, the calm one, the flexible one, the one who didn't make things difficult. I worried that asserting myself would look like a personality change, and personality changes make people uncomfortable, so I normalized it. I told myself that families speak for each other sometimes, that this was closeness, not control, that if it really bothered me, I'd feel more upset than I did. But that was another miscalculation. Disrespect doesn't always announce itself with anger. Sometimes it arrives quietly, and you don't feel rage, you feel diminished. And diminished is easier to ignore, easier to rationalize. I began to edit myself in advance. I'd decide not to share something because I knew how it would be reframed. I'd simplify my answers knowing they'd be summarized anyway. Over time, I spoke less, not because I had nothing to say, but because I was tired of being translated incorrectly. My brother didn't notice the shift, or if he did, he interpreted it as confirmation of his assumptions. "See? She's private. She prefers it this way." And because I didn't contradict him, the story held. The hardest part wasn't that he spoke for me. It was that everyone else let him. The family system adjusted seamlessly, as systems do to whoever takes initiative. Silence creates a vacuum. Someone will always fill it. I became complicit in my own erasure. That's a difficult truth to sit with, but it's an honest one. I remember one afternoon when a relative pulled me aside and said, "Your brother mentioned you're going through some stuff. I hope you're okay." The concern was genuine, but the information wasn't his to share. I smiled, I reassured them. I said I was fine. Later alone, I felt something close to grief. Not because of what was shared, but because I hadn't been asked. That was when I realized I had been mistaking endurance for integrity. I believed that staying quiet meant I was taking the high road. But the high road still leads somewhere. And in this case, it was leading away from myself. By normalizing these moments, I had taught everyone how to treat my boundaries as optional, flexible, available for reinterpretation. Still, I didn't confront him, not yet, because part of me still hoped this was temporary, that once things settled, the dynamic would correct itself, that my brother would notice my withdrawal and ask why. He didn't, and that absence of curiosity was its own answer. What I didn't understand then, but would learn much later, was that once a role becomes convenient, people rarely question it, not out of cruelty, but out of comfort. And comfort, when unexamined, can become a form of quiet entitlement. It took me longer than it should have to realize that I wasn't just being spoken over, I was being positioned. Families, like any system, tend to assign roles, not formally, not consciously. They emerge through repetition, through who reacts and who absorbs, who disrupts and who smooths. And once a role works, it sticks. Mine had crystallized. I was the reliable one, the adapter, the emotional shock absorber. If something needed doing quietly, I did it. If something needed to be understood without explanation, that was assumed of me. I was the one who would get it. That phrase, "she'll get it," was used often. It sounded like respect. It felt like a burden. Because getting it meant not asking for more, not questioning timing, not objecting to how things were handled. It meant accommodating decisions after they were made, not participating while they were forming. My brother's role was different. He was the spokesperson, the clarifier, the one whose perspective carried urgency. When he shared concerns, they were framed as protective. When I stayed quiet, it was framed as agreement. No one ever sat me down and said, "This is who you are to us now." It happened incrementally, through thousands of small interactions, through the absence of interruption when someone else spoke for me, through the expectation that I would adjust rather than assert. And because I didn't resist, the role solidified. I began to notice how often my presence was treated as functional rather than participatory. I was asked to help, to support, to listen, but rarely to decide. When opinions were solicited, they were often framed as afterthoughts. "What do you think?" asked politely, but after momentum had already been set. It wasn't malicious, it was efficient. Efficiency has a way of sidelining the quiet. The more I reflected, the clearer it became. My family didn't see me as someone who needed protecting, because I had never asked for it. They didn't see me as vulnerable, because I managed discomfort privately. They didn't see me as someone whose autonomy required defending, because I had never enforced it publicly. I had taught them how to treat me. That realization was painful, not because it excused what happened later, but because it explained how it became possible. My brother fit neatly into the complementary role. He spoke quickly, he expressed concern loudly, he framed his actions as responsibility, and in a system that values visible engagement, that reads as leadership. So when he spoke for me, it didn't register as overreach. It registered as care. Meanwhile, my silence was interpreted as trust. I remember thinking, at one point, if I ever did object, would they even recognize it as an objection? Or would it be dismissed as stress, sensitivity, a temporary deviation from my assigned role? That question stayed with me, because roles don't just define how others see you. They define what kind of resistance they're willing to believe you're capable of. I wasn't seen as someone who needed consent before being discussed. I was seen as someone who would understand after the fact. And understanding in that context was a substitute for permission. Once I saw the structure, I couldn't unsee it. I noticed how often my brother's interpretations of me went unchallenged, how easily my privacy was treated as flexible, how quickly others deferred to his framing. It wasn't because he was always right. It was because the system had decided he was the narrator, and I was the character. Still, I stayed quiet, not because I agreed, but because I was beginning to understand the terrain. I could see that reacting emotionally would only reinforce the idea that I was fragile or overreacting, that confronting him directly, without leverage, would be reframed as conflict. So instead of speaking, I started observing. Roles reveal themselves most clearly when you stop performing them. And the moment I began to step back, even slightly, I could feel the system strain. Not enough to break, just enough to notice. That was when I realized something fundamental had shifted. I no longer wanted to be understood. I wanted to be accurate. And those are not the same thing. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen during a revelation or a confrontation. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, alone, with nothing but quiet and time. I was sitting at my kitchen table, a cup of coffee cooling beside me, scrolling through messages from the past few weeks. Nothing alarming on the surface. Family group chats, casual check-ins, a few comments that, taken individually, meant very little. But together, they formed a picture I hadn't wanted to see. There was a message from my brother explaining something about me to a relative. Again. Another from a family member responding to him, not me, about something that directly involved my life. No one was being cruel. No one was being careless. They were being comfortable. That was the moment I stopped asking myself whether I was overreacting. I wasn't angry. I wasn't hurt in a dramatic sense. What I felt instead was clarity. Sharp, quiet, unmistakable. The kind of clarity that doesn't rush you, but settles in your chest like a fact you can't argue with. I realized that my silence was no longer neutral. Up until then, I had believed that staying quiet kept the peace, that it prevented misunderstandings, that it preserved relationships. But in that moment, I understood that my silence had become part of the mechanism that allowed others to speak for me without checking first. I wasn't being patient, I was being predictable. And predictability in a system like this is exploitable. That afternoon, I didn't draft a message. I didn't rehearse a confrontation. I didn't even feel the urge to correct anything immediately. What changed wasn't my behavior. It was my orientation. I stopped waiting to be acknowledged. I began asking a different set of questions. Not, how do I explain this? But who benefits if I don't? I thought about the way information moved through my family. Who spoke first? Who set the tone? Who framed the context? And I saw with uncomfortable clarity how easily truth could be positioned, not altered, just arranged. Truth doesn't have to be false to be harmful. It just has to be strategically placed. That's when I understood something I had missed before. My brother wasn't just speaking, he was timing. He chose moments when I wasn't present. He chose audiences who trusted him. He chose framings that sounded responsible, not intrusive. And because I had never challenged his authority as narrator, those choices went unquestioned. That realization didn't make me furious. It made me still. There's a kind of stillness that comes when you stop hoping things will correct themselves. When you stop expecting fairness to emerge organically. When you accept that if you want agency, you have to create the conditions for it. I sat there for a long time, not planning revenge, not imagining outcomes. Just letting the truth settle. Letting go of the fantasy that being reasonable would automatically protect me. That was the day I stopped confusing kindness with passivity. I decided quietly that I would no longer offer unguarded access to my life simply because it made others comfortable. I didn't announce this decision. I didn't explain it. I just began to hold things closer. Information, I realized, is not neutral. It's relational. And once shared, it doesn't belong to you anymore. That afternoon marked the beginning of a different kind of silence. Not the silence of avoidance, the silence of intention. I didn't know yet what I would do with what I was seeing. I only knew that continuing as I had been was no longer an option. The cost was too high, even if it was invisible to everyone else. I closed my messages, I finished my coffee, and I reached for the notebook I had kept, half unconsciously, for years, dates, conversations, moments that felt off, but never quite alarming enough to name. For the first time, I wasn't writing to remember. I was writing to understand. And understanding, once it arrives, doesn't leave you the way you were. After that afternoon, my silence changed shape. Before, it had been reflexive, a default setting I barely questioned. Now it was deliberate, chosen, and that difference mattered more than anyone else realized. I didn't announce boundaries. I didn't confront my brother. I didn't correct the record. Not yet. I understood that reacting too quickly would only alert the system that something was shifting. And systems, when threatened, tend to close ranks. So instead I observed. I let conversations happen without volunteering additional context. When asked questions, I answered truthfully but briefly. I stopped preemptively explaining myself. I stopped cushioning statements so they'd land softly. I let my words stand on their own, or not appear at all. To most people, nothing had changed. To my brother, something felt off. I could see it in the way he checked in more often, the way his questions became more specific. "Everything okay? You've been quiet lately." The irony wasn't lost on me. My silence had only become noticeable once it stopped serving its usual function. Still, he interpreted it the only way that fit his existing narrative: withdrawal, sensitivity, stress, weakness. That assumption gave me space. People underestimate what they believe they understand. And because my brother believed he understood me, he didn't look too closely. He didn't imagine I was recalibrating. He assumed I was retreating. That misread was crucial. I began to notice how often he spoke about concern rather than asking for consent. How easily he justified sharing information by framing it as protection. How rarely he checked whether I wanted help, only whether he thought I needed it. Silence gave me distance. Distance gave me perspective. I started tracking patterns, not obsessively, not emotionally, just factually. When information moved, who moved it? When decisions were discussed, who was present? When my name came up, who was speaking? The answers were consistent. I wasn't preparing for a confrontation. I was preparing clarity. One of the most difficult things to accept was that no one was going to intervene on my behalf. Not because they didn't care, but because they didn't see a problem. The system was functioning smoothly. I was still cooperative. My brother still looked responsible. From the outside, everything appeared stable, so I stopped waiting for validation. I also stopped offering easy access to my inner life. I shared less, not out of secrecy, but out of discernment. I became selective about what I said, and more importantly, when. This wasn't about withholding truth. It was about protecting context. Without context, truth can be bent. With context, it has weight. The more intentional my silence became, the more I could feel the shift internally. I wasn't shrinking. I was consolidating. My energy wasn't being dispersed through constant accommodation. It was being stored. And something interesting happened. The fewer explanations I gave, the fewer assumptions people could confidently make. The space I left empty became uncomfortable. Not for me, but for those used to filling it. My brother began to check in indirectly, through others. "Have you heard from Morgan? She seems distant." Again, concern, framed outward, never inward. I took note. Silence, I realized, isn't absence. It's positioning. When used unconsciously, it leaves you vulnerable. When used deliberately, it gives you leverage. I wasn't manipulating anyone. I wasn't deceiving. I was simply no longer volunteering pieces of myself into a system that had shown me it didn't handle them carefully. That distinction mattered. I also understood something else. Whatever was coming next couldn't be emotional. If I wanted my autonomy back, it had to be reclaimed in a way that aligned with who I actually was. Measured, principled, calm. No outbursts, no ultimatums, no dramatic reveals. Just alignment. I didn't yet know what the turning point would be. But I knew this. When the moment arrived, I would not be reacting. I would be ready. What no one noticed, because they weren't looking for it, was that while I appeared to be retreating, I was actually refining. Silence gave me time. Time to observe without being observed. Time to see how information traveled when I wasn't feeding the system. Time to understand the difference between what people said publicly and what they admitted privately. I didn't become secretive. I became precise. I started documenting things the way I always had, but with intention now. Dates, exact phrasing, who said what and in what context. Not interpretations, facts. I wasn't building a case against anyone. I was building a map. Patterns reveal themselves when you stop interrupting them. I noticed how often my brother framed his actions as protective after the fact. How he shared information under the banner of concern rather than consent. How he positioned himself as the intermediary, even when none was needed. I also noticed something else, something quieter. He rarely checked whether his involvement was welcome. That absence told me more than any argument could have. As I paid closer attention, I realized this wasn't just about me. This was about how my brother related to uncertainty. When things were ambiguous, he resolved them by speaking, by acting, by filling silence with narrative. And because I had always allowed that, He had come to see my life as part of his territory to manage, not maliciously, habitually. That distinction mattered, not to excuse him, but to understand the mechanics at play. I also began to notice how differently people treated me depending on who had spoken to them first. If my brother had framed something, the conversation would have followed his logic. If he hadn't, there would have been more openness, more curiosity, more room for me to exist as myself. That was leverage, not in the sense of power over someone, but in the sense of understanding where influence actually lived. Influence, I learned, doesn't always belong to the person with the truth. It belongs to the person who introduces it. And my brother had been introducing my truth for me. Once I understood that, I stopped trying to correct individual moments. Correction is reactive. It keeps you on the defensive. Instead, I focused on positioning myself so that when my truth entered a room, it would arrive directly, not filtered. I also took practical steps. I adjusted privacy settings. I changed who had access to certain information. Not dramatically, just thoughtfully. I stopped sharing updates in group settings. I redirected conversations when they veered toward my personal life without my invitation. Again, nothing anyone could point to and say, "She's acting strange." But the flow had changed. My brother noticed, though he didn't understand why. He began asking more pointed questions, fishing for reassurance. "You know I've got your back, right?" he'd say. Statements disguised as questions. I responded neutrally. I didn't challenge him. I didn't reassure him either. That ambiguity unsettled him. What he never noticed was that I had stopped relying on his interpretation of events altogether. I was forming my own understanding, grounded in evidence, not emotion. There's a myth that preparation looks like plotting. That if you're getting ready for something, you must be angry or scheming. In reality, preparation often looks like stillness. It looks like listening more than speaking, like documenting instead of reacting, like waiting until you understand the full shape of the situation before deciding where to apply pressure, or whether to apply it at all. I wasn't waiting for a dramatic reveal. I was waiting for certainty, and certainty came quietly. It arrived in the realization that my brother believed he was acting in my best interest, but he was also acting in his own. That his version of concern conveniently aligned with moments when he needed credibility, support, or moral authority within the family. That overlap was not accidental. It wasn't sinister either. It was human, but human behavior still has consequences. What no one noticed was that I had stopped seeing this as a personal conflict and started seeing it as a structural one. The issue wasn't what was being said. It was who had the authority to say it. An authority, once assumed, doesn't relinquish itself voluntarily. It has to be rendered unnecessary. That was the insight that changed everything. I didn't need to confront my brother to reclaim my story. I needed to make his role in it obsolete. And to do that, I needed one thing above all else: timing. The reveal wasn't dramatic. There was no gasp, no surge of adrenaline, no moment where I felt triumphant or vindicated. It happened quietly, the way most realizations do, when something you've been circling suddenly comes into focus, and you understand that the picture has always been there. You just hadn't known how to look at it yet. I was reviewing my notes one evening, not searching for anything specific, just reading through them the way you reread an old journal, not to relive, but to contextualize. Dates, messages, repeated phrases. The same justifications appear again and again in my brother's words. And then I noticed something I hadn't fully named before. Every time he shared something personal about me with the family, it coincided with the moment when he needed alignment, support, credibility, emotional authority. It wasn't random, it wasn't reactive, it was situational. He never disclosed when things were calm. He never spoke on my behalf when there was nothing at stake. The timing was always precise, just early enough to shape perception, just late enough that it looked like concern rather than control. That was the moment it clicked. Truth became a weapon the moment it served him. Not because the truth was distorted, but because it was deployed. He wasn't lying. That's what made it so effective. He was selecting, framing, introducing information into a context where it worked in his favor and limited my ability to respond without seeming defensive. I sat back in my chair and let that settle. This wasn't about malice. It was about utility. My life, my privacy, had become useful to him in ways I had never consented to. It allowed him to position himself as the responsible one, the protector, the moral center in moments where that role benefited him. And because I had always been calm, accommodating, non-reactive, the system accepted his framing without friction. That was the leverage. Not leverage in the sense of power over him, but clarity over the situation. For the first time, I understood that confronting him emotionally would accomplish nothing. He would defend his intentions. He would emphasize concern. He would frame my objection as a misunderstanding. And the family would side with the narrative that felt safer. So I didn't confront him. I also didn't expose him. I did something quieter and far more decisive. I removed the incentive. I stopped providing unguarded information entirely. I didn't announce this change. I didn't justify it. I simply made myself the primary source again. I spoke directly to people when it mattered. Briefly, calmly, without emotion. I corrected nothing publicly, but I clarified privately when needed, in ways that were factual and unembellished. I didn't say, he shouldn't have said that. I said, here's what's actually happening. No blame, no defensiveness, just accuracy. And something subtle shifted. Without new information to manage, my brother's role began to thin. He had nothing current to frame, nothing timely to offer. His concern started to sound speculative rather than informed. I could see the discomfort in him, not anger, not guilt, but uncertainty. He wasn't sure where he fit anymore. That was when I understood something essential. Leverage doesn't require exposure. It requires alignment. I had aligned my actions with my values. I wasn't reacting to him. I was reclaiming myself. Privately, I also made peace with a hard truth. Even if my brother genuinely believed he was helping, intent did not outweigh impact. And understanding that difference freed me from the need to argue about motives. I didn't need him to admit wrongdoing. I needed him to lose access. That was the private reveal, not of his behavior, but of my own position within it. I saw exactly where my agency had been surrendered, and I took it back without spectacle. No one applauded, no one noticed, and that was the point. Power reclaimed quietly doesn't announce itself. It simply changes the landscape. For the first time in a long while, I felt steady. Not in the old way that required endurance, but in a new way that required nothing from anyone else. I wasn't waiting anymore. I was choosing. Once you see clearly, you can't pretend you don't. That's the moment most people romanticize. The dramatic crossroads, the charged decision, the internal monologue filled with urgency. But real decision points are quieter. They arrive when you've already done most of the thinking, and all that's left is choosing whether you're willing to live with the consequences of acting on it. I had options. I could confront my brother directly, lay everything out, ask for accountability, demand change. That path was tempting in its simplicity, but it relied on something I no longer trusted: his willingness to hear me without reframing the narrative. I could expose the pattern to the family, present the timeline, show how and when my privacy had been shared, but that would turn my life into evidence, my boundaries into exhibits. I didn't want my autonomy restored through public debate. I could also do nothing, continue limiting access quietly and let time dilute the impact. That option felt safest, but also incomplete. It left the structure intact, just with fewer moving parts. Then there was the fourth option, the one I hadn't considered before, because it required me to step fully out of my assigned role. I could remove myself from the system that allowed this dynamic to function. Not physically, not dramatically, structurally. That option didn't involve accusations or ultimatums. It involved shifting how and where I showed up. It meant redefining what access to me looked like, and accepting that some people would interpret that as distance, coldness, even betrayal. I sat with that discomfort for a long time, because choosing autonomy often means choosing misunderstanding. I asked myself the hardest question: what outcome am I actually responsible for? I wasn't responsible for my brother's intentions. I wasn't responsible for my family's interpretations. I was responsible for my own alignment. And alignment required finality, not revenge, not punishment, just a decision that couldn't be walked back without cost. I decided that from that point forward, I would no longer participate in any context where my story could be managed by someone else. That meant fewer shared spaces, fewer group discussions, fewer casual updates. It also meant that if something about me needed to be known, it would come from me, or not at all. That decision was irreversible in a quiet way. Once you stop offering yourself for interpretation, you can't return to being easily interpreted without undoing the work. I didn't explain this decision to my brother. I didn't explain it to my family. I explained it to myself. And then I acted accordingly. I declined certain invitations. I redirected conversations. I became selective, not distant, but intentional. I stopped filling the silence that wasn't mine to fill. The hardest part wasn't the behavior change. It was the emotional residue, the guilt that surfaces when you stop performing a role others rely on. I had to let that pass without engaging it. Guilt, I learned, often signals transition, not wrongdoing. I knew there would be fallout. Confusion, questions I wouldn't answer, assumptions I wouldn't correct. But I also knew this. Anything that required me to sacrifice my agency to maintain harmony was not harmony. It was compliance. That was the decision. Not loud, not righteous, just firm. I didn't know when the consequences would appear. I only knew they would. Systems don't adjust without friction. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of that friction, because whatever came next would be built on a choice I had made consciously, not a role I had drifted into. And that changed everything. When people imagine decisive action, they picture motion, announcements, declarations, visible change. What they don't picture is stillness. The kind of stillness that looks like nothing is happening, when in fact everything important already happened. That's what this phase was. From the outside, my life looked unchanged. I still showed up to family events selectively. I still responded to messages politely. I still sounded like myself, calm, measured, reasonable. What no one saw was how carefully I had restructured the way I moved through the system. I stopped participating in group conversations where personal information traveled loose. If I were present, I stayed present, but I didn't offer details. I spoke about work, about neutral topics, about things that couldn't be repurposed later. If a conversation drifted toward my personal life without my initiation, I let it drift past. At first, people assumed I was tired, busy, going through a phase. No one assumed a strategy. I also changed how I communicated one-on-one. When someone asked a question that felt invasive or preloaded with assumptions, I answered narrowly, truthfully, but without narrative. I learned how to say less without being evasive. There's a difference between secrecy and precision. I chose precision. Behind the scenes, I made practical adjustments. I consolidated my finances. I reviewed shared accounts, shared obligations, and shared points of access. Not because anything illegal or unethical was happening, but because shared access creates shared authority. And I was done sharing authority over my life. I stopped looping my brother into decisions that didn't require his input. I didn't announce this change. I simply stopped. When he offered advice, I thanked him and didn't act on it. When he asked follow-up questions, I answered vaguely. He didn't push. He didn't have to. He assumed he'd be brought in eventually, as he always had been. That assumption bought me time. What struck me most during this period was how little resistance I encountered. Not because my family agreed with my choices, but because they didn't fully register them. Change that doesn't announce itself is easy to overlook. Silence, once again, did its work. I also became more visible in spaces outside my family. Professionally, socially. I invested energy where my voice was received directly, not filtered. Where my presence wasn't functional, but contributory. That contrast sharpened my resolve. In those spaces, no one spoke for me. No one summarized my intentions. No one reframed my silence as something else. I was simply allowed to exist as I was. And that reminded me how distorted the family dynamic had become. Still within the family, everything appeared intact, until it didn't. The first signs came quietly. A missed update. A decision was made without consulting my brother, whom he assumed would be part of it. A moment where he realized, too late, that he no longer had the information needed to step in. I saw the confusion flicker across his face once. During a conversation he thought he was leading. He referenced something outdated. I didn't correct him. Someone else did. That moment passed quickly, but something had cracked. I wasn't taking anything from him. I was no longer providing what made his role necessary. And roles, when they lose function, don't collapse immediately. They wobble. They create friction. They reveal how dependent the system was on them. I felt no satisfaction watching that happen, only inevitability. Moving in silence meant accepting that I wouldn't be seen as decisive. that my actions wouldn't be recognized as intentional, that people might misinterpret distance as indifference. I accepted that, because clarity doesn't need witnesses to be real. I wasn't waiting for acknowledgement. I was waiting for the system to respond. And it did, just not all at once. The consequences didn't arrive with confrontation. They arrived with an absence. At first, it was subtle enough to dismiss. A conversation that felt slightly off. A moment of hesitation where there hadn't been one before. My brother paused mid-sentence, searching for context he used to have ready. No one announced that something had changed. They just began to feel it. My brother was the first to sense the loss, even if he couldn't name it. He reached out more frequently, not urgently, not accusingly, just checking. His messages carried a different tone now. Less certainty, more probing. Did I miss something? Has anything changed? I answered politely, briefly, without elaboration. That restraint unsettled him more than any argument could have, because what he was experiencing wasn't rejection, it was irrelevance. And irrelevance is harder to fight than opposition. You can debate someone who pushes back. You can't debate someone who no longer needs your participation. Within the family, small disruptions began to surface. Plans were made without the usual coordination. Information didn't circulate the way it used to. Someone would reference a detail that was no longer current, and no one rushed to clarify it on my behalf. For the first time, people had to ask me, and they weren't used to that. I noticed the discomfort, not hostility, but confusion. The system had relied on a certain efficiency. My brother spoke, I complied, others adjusted. Now that shortcut was gone. At one gathering, a relative asked my brother a question about me. He started to answer, and stopped. He glanced at me, uncertain. I met his eyes, calm, expectant, silent. He deferred. That moment lasted maybe 2 seconds. No one commented on it, but something fundamental had shifted. Later I heard that he had expressed concern, quietly, to someone else. That I seemed distant. That he didn't know what was going on with me anymore. What he didn't say, but what I could hear between the lines, was that he no longer knew how to position himself. The concern he voiced now sounded different, less authoritative, less grounded. Without access to real information, his framing lost weight. And people noticed. Not consciously, not critically, just enough to start hesitating. That hesitation was the beginning of accountability. Not because anyone was assigning blame, but because the narrative no longer flowed automatically. I felt the temptation then to explain myself, to soothe the discomfort, to reassure everyone that nothing was wrong. But that would have restored the old balance. So I didn't. I let the discomfort exist. That was harder than I expected. Not because I doubted my decision, but because I had spent so long absorbing emotional friction on behalf of others. Letting it sit felt unnatural, almost wrong. But it wasn't wrong. It was necessary. My brother tried once to reassert his role. He shared a concern about me that was outdated, well-meaning, but inaccurate. Someone gently corrected him. Not me. Someone else. He went quiet after that. I didn't feel victorious. I felt resolved. This was the consequence of speaking for someone without consent. Eventually, you lose credibility when the ground shifts beneath you and no one tells you. What struck me most was how little effort this required from me. I wasn't defending myself. I wasn't exposing him. I was simply no longer cooperating with a structure that depended on my compliance. And without that compliance, the structure began to strain. People started engaging me differently, more directly, more carefully, not out of fear, but out of recalibration. They were adjusting to a version of me they hadn't been required to consider before. That adjustment was uncomfortable for everyone, including me. But discomfort is not harm, and harmony that requires erasure is not peace. This was the beginning, not of punishment, but of rebalancing. And once that process starts, it doesn't stop just because someone wishes it would. By the time anyone tried to fix things, the structure had already changed. That's the part people misunderstand about quiet shifts. They don't feel urgent until they're irreversible. There's no alarm, no clear moment where someone says, wait, something's wrong. Just a slow realization that the old methods no longer work. My brother was the last to accept this. At first he assumed this was temporary, a mood, a phase, something that would resolve itself once I was ready to talk again. He treated my distance as something to be managed rather than respected. So he waited. When waiting didn't work, he tried reassurance. He reminded me, casually, indirectly, of how close we were, how much we trusted each other, how he'd always looked out for me. All of it was true, and none of it addressed the actual issue. What he wanted was restoration, a return to the familiar dynamic where his involvement was assumed and my boundaries were flexible. What I wanted was alignment, something entirely different. He never asked that directly. Instead, he tried to re-enter the system through old doors. He shared concern again, quietly, hoping it would land the way it used to. But without fresh information, his words sounded vague, speculative. People listened politely, and then moved on. That's when I saw the panic begin. Not loud, not dramatic, just subtle signs of disorientation. He asked more questions than before. He checked in more often. He sought reassurance from others, instead of from me. The confidence he once carried so easily began to fracture, and still, he never asked for consent. That omission was telling, because asking would have required acknowledging that the access he once had was not guaranteed. The family, meanwhile, tried to smooth things over in their own way. Gentle suggestions, invitations framed as reconnection, comments like, "You should talk to your brother," or "I think he's just worried about you." I understood their intention. They wanted harmony, familiarity, resolution. But resolution requires understanding what's actually broken. And what was broken wasn't communication. It was entitlement. Not malicious entitlement, but ingrained. The assumption that my life was available for interpretation, that my silence was a problem to be solved, that distance meant something needed correcting. No one asked me what I wanted. They asked how to restore what they were comfortable with. By then, it was too late. Not because I was angry, not because I wanted distance forever, but because the conditions that allowed that dynamic to exist no longer applied. I had changed how I moved, how I spoke, how I shared. And those changes weren't emotional reactions, they were structural decisions. Structures don't revert just because someone feels uncomfortable. At one point, my brother tried to have a casual conversation with me. He spoke carefully, choosing his words with more restraint than I'd ever heard from him. He talked about misunderstandings, about intentions, about how families sometimes overstep without realizing it. I listened. He never said the one thing that mattered. I shouldn't have shared your story without asking. Without that acknowledgement, everything else was noise. I didn't interrupt him. I didn't argue. I didn't correct his framing. I simply didn't offer the reassurance he was seeking. That was when I saw it clearly in his eyes. The realization that this wasn't something he could talk his way back into. Access once lost can't be reclaimed through explanation alone. It requires humility, and humility can't be forced. So the attempts faded, slowly, awkwardly, the way people back away from a door they suddenly realize is locked. Not out of spite, but out of uncertainty. The family adjusted again, this time with more caution. They stopped pushing. They stopped suggesting fixes. They accepted reluctantly that something had shifted beyond their influence. What struck me most was how little satisfaction I felt. This wasn't a victory. It was a consequence. And consequence doesn't celebrate. It settles. By the time anyone realized what had been lost, the ease, the shortcuts, the assumed access, it was already gone. Not taken, just no longer offered. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was nothing like people imagine. There was no raised voice, no list of grievances, no emotional release. It took place in a quiet space, at a time that felt almost anticlimactic. No audience, no urgency, just two people sitting across from each other, both aware that something fundamental had shifted, and that pretending otherwise was no longer possible. My brother initiated it. He didn't say the word confrontation. He said he wanted to clear the air. His tone was careful, restrained in a way I hadn't heard before. The confidence that once carried him through conversations had softened into something closer to caution. I listened. He spoke about concern, about confusion, about how distant I had become. He said he felt shut out, that he didn't know where he stood with me anymore. He framed his actions the way he always had, as care that may have gone too far, but never meant harm. I didn't interrupt him. When he finished, there was a pause, not tense, just quiet. Then I spoke. I didn't recount events. I didn't present evidence. I didn't challenge his intentions. None of that was necessary. I said calmly, "You shared parts of my life without asking me, more than once, and you did it in moments when it served you. That changed how I trust you, That was it. No accusation, no emotion layered on top. Just a statement of impact." He looked startled, not defensive, not angry, just caught off guard by how plainly it was said. as if he had expected negotiation and instead received a boundary. He started to respond, to explain, to clarify his intentions. I stopped him gently. "I'm not questioning why you did it," I said. "I'm explaining why things are different now." That distinction landed. There was another silence, longer this time. He asked what I wanted. That question mattered more than anything he had said so far. I told him the truth, that I needed my life to be handled by me, that I wasn't cutting him out, but I wasn't offering automatic access anymore, that if something about me needed to be shared, I would share it myself. He nodded, slowly. He didn't argue. He didn't apologize the way people do when they want absolution. He simply said he hadn't realized how much space he'd taken. I believed him, and I also knew that realization didn't undo the past. The conversation ended without resolution in the traditional sense. There was no promise to do better, no emotional reconciliation, just mutual acknowledgement that the dynamic had changed and wouldn't revert. What surprised me was how light I felt afterward. Not relieved, not triumphant, aligned. I hadn't said everything I could have said. I had said what was necessary, nothing more. That's the power of calm confrontation. It doesn't seek to win. It seeks to clarify. And clarity, once offered, doesn't need reinforcement. We parted without drama, without tension, without certainty about what our relationship would look like moving forward. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of that uncertainty, because whatever came next would be built on consent, not assumption. And that was enough. I am not who I was when this began. That doesn't mean I'm hardened or closed off or less generous. It means I am more exact, more deliberate about where my energy goes and why. I no longer confuse availability with love or silence with strength. The version of me that existed before was shaped by usefulness, by how well I could adapt, absorb, and smooth. I was proud of that adaptability. It had kept relationships intact, had made rooms feel safer, and had allowed others to relax around me. Me. But I understand now that adaptability without boundaries doesn't make you straight. Makes it convenient. Who I am now is quieter, but not invisible. I speak less, but with more precision. I don't rush to explain myself. I don't soften truths to make them easier to digest. If something matters, I say it plainly. If it doesn't, I let it pass. That change has altered how people engage with me. Some are more careful now. They ask instead of assuming. They wait for me to speak instead of filling the space. Others keep their distance, unsure of where they stand without the old cues. I accept both. My relationship with my brother exists in a new shape, less automatic, more intentional. There is more space between us, and also more honesty within that space. He no longer narrates my life. I no longer expect him to understand me without asking. We are learning slowly what respect looks like without familiarity doing the work for us. And I am learning something even more important. I don't need to be fully understood to be whole. I used to believe that if I could just explain myself clearly enough, gently enough, people would meet me where I was. Now I know that explanation doesn't create respect. Boundaries do. I don't feel bitterness toward my family. I don't feel the need to revisit old moments or reassign blame. What happened doesn't define us, but it did redefine me. I'm more private now, not because I'm hiding, but because I'm selective. I don't offer my inner life as communal property. I don't allow concern to replace consent. That choice has brought a kind of calm I didn't know was possible. It's not the calm of compliance, it's the calm of alignment. I trust myself more, not because I'm always right, but because I no longer abandon my own perspective to preserve someone else's comfort. If something feels off, I pause. I listen. I act when I'm ready, not when the system expects me to. I also forgive myself for staying quiet too long, for confusing endurance with virtue, for believing that being low impact meant being safe. Those beliefs kept me functional, but they didn't keep me free. Freedom, I've learned, doesn't arrive through confrontation alone. It arrives through consistent, unglamorous choices, through saying no without explanation, letting misunderstandings stand when correcting them would cost you your integrity. ID. Who I am now is someone who understands that power doesn't need volume. It doesn't need validation. It doesn't need to be seen to be real. It only needs to be rooted. And I am. There's a lesson in all of this, but it isn't the kind that fits neatly into a quote or a warning. It's quieter, more uncomfortable, and it asks something of us that most of us were never taught how to do. The truth is, no one in this story set out to hurt anyone. My brother didn't wake up one day planning to betray me. My family didn't consciously decide that my boundaries were optional. And I didn't choose invisibility out of fear. I chose it out of habit, out of love, out of a belief that being steady was the most ethical way to exist. And yet harm still occurred, because harm doesn't always come from cruelty. Sometimes it comes from convenience. When someone is calm, capable, and accommodating, it's easy to forget that they still have edges, that their silence still contains consent or refusal, that their life is not a resource to be managed, no matter how good the intentions. The most important thing I learned is this: truth is not neutral. It carries power the moment it's shared. And when it's shared without consent, even in the name of care, it stops being connection and becomes control. That doesn't mean we stop being honest. It means we become responsible. Responsible for timing, responsible for context, responsible for whose story we're telling and why. For a long time, I believed that if I stayed quiet, I was choosing peace. What I didn't see was that peace built on self-erasure is temporary. It holds only as long as you're willing to disappear inside it. The moment I stopped disappearing, the system resisted. Not with anger, but with confusion, discomfort, and the urge to fix what had changed. That resistance wasn't proof that I was wrong. It was proof that something had been benefiting from my silence. I didn't reclaim my autonomy through exposure or punishment. I reclaimed it through alignment, by making sure my actions matched my values, even when that made others uneasy. That's what quiet dominance actually looks like. Not force, not humiliation, not spectacle, just refusal. Refusal to be summarized without consent. Refusal to be managed in the name of love. Refusal to keep offering access to people who haven't learned how to hold it carefully. If you take anything from this story, let it be this: you don't owe anyone unlimited access to your inner life just because you've always been the one who understands. And you don't have to burn bridges to stop being walked across. Sometimes, all it takes is stepping out of the role you were assigned and letting the system adjust without you cushioning the impact. I'm curious, and I'll ask this openly without judgment. Have you ever realized that the moment you stopped explaining yourself was the moment others finally had to see you clearly? If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your experience in the comments.